Good morning, NSF. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I expect a few more of you will be signing in as we get started, but it is 9 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started with our program. I am very honored and thrilled to have an esteemed speaker and an NSF board member join us today for our 6th program in the War in Ukraine series. This is exceedingly important information that we're going to be getting today, and we have in our series so far. Thank you very much for being here, Professor Ruehsen, and our NSF board member, Dan Lafraise. And first, before we get started, Moyara, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. The short bio was included, but please note that I made a typo in the announcement. I got her title right in the top of the announcement, but my fingers still type Middlebury, or type Monterey Institute of International Studies, not Middlebury. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Ruehsen to take it away and give us some insight on the issues of illicit finance, money laundering, Russian sanctions, and how all this pertains to the war in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for that opening, Maureen. And yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions other than to say that I have been teaching financial crime and organized crime related courses for more than 2 decades. And I am currently the director of the Financial Crime Intelligence Program at Middlebury. I teach both at the graduate school in Monterey, as well. I also teach courses for the undergraduates at the mothership, as we like to call it, in Vermont as well. And I do all of that from Nevada. So there you go. Yeah. I'm also a certified anti-money laundering specialist and a certified financial crime specialist. And that covers everything from money laundering to sanctions evasion to cybercrime and a variety of other things. Well, let's get started on the topic at hand, the war in Ukraine, and in particular, all of the sanctions that we're imposing on mostly Russian oligarchs, but also a lot of institutions as well. Sanctions as a foreign policy tool. A lot of people wonder, do sanctions work? Well, they are a very blunt instrument for sure when it comes to trying to encourage a change in behavior. And a lot of people say, well, sanctions are not very effective when it comes to regime change. And it's true, they have a very bad track record. But the idea is to try to put pressure on a government, not necessarily to lead to regime change, but to lead to a change in behavior. And I'm not going to try to defend sanctions as a foreign policy tool, because I do think that they come with a lot of collateral damage. You're hurting the general population with a lot of economic hardship. You're not, even when you're just targeting people at the top, supposedly targeting people at the top. But there's many people who argue, well, when you do push for financial sanctions, targeted financial sanctions, it does often lead people to the negotiating table. Hasn't happened yet in the case of Russia, but it has happened in the past with North Korea. It has happened in the past with Iran. But, again, that's the other side of the argument, that yes, they can work in some respects. And again, we're trying to discourage behavior. Now, it's possible that Russia's actions would have been even, more severe and maybe using weapons that, I don't want to go in the direction of nuclear weapons, but, something awful. And maybe they were held back from doing that because of all of these sanctions that we've been ramping up. They definitely have become more popular as a tool, but I will say that in the early years, um, the sanctions were more of a comprehensive general nature, and only in the last decade have we been um, imposing targeted sanctions aimed at individuals. I mean, we've done that before, certainly since 9/11 and even before that, but I mean, in terms of ramping it up. And why are they so effective at causing economic pain? And why do we, or how do we have the extra jurisdictional reach to impose sanctions on individuals who may have not set foot in the United States, on institutions that have no presence in the United States, and on transactions between countries that have nothing to do with the United States? And it's because of the primacy of the US dollar. We can impose sanctions on any financial institution that conducts, or we call them secondary sanctions, that conducts transactions in US dollars for any sanctioned entity or individual. And that's a really, powerful position to be in. There are some who wonder, are we abusing that power and maybe using the sanctions tool a little too enthusiastically? But it is extraordinary how much reach we have, and financial institutions are going to do their darndest to try to not accidentally evade, or definitely not deliberately evade, but accidentally evade sanctions, because they don't want to lose their dollar clearing privileges. And they have seen how US regulators have imposed, first it was tens of millions, then hundreds of millions, and now billions of dollars in fines on non-US financial institutions. And so we've been slowly seeing a ramping up of these sanctions, starting in February and then into March. And new sanctions are being added every day. Now they're going after family members and mistresses and close associates of the individuals that they've sanctioned. Now, this is a diagram that US Treasury provided in one of their recent announcements. And I want you to notice at the top there, there are a number of companies. They offer the name of the company, but then they also call it a front company. And I want to take a moment here to talk about front companies versus shell companies versus shelf companies. What we're trying to do here is, we call it piercing the corporate veil, because you have a lot of sanctioned individuals who are hiding behind anonymous shell companies, and you want to find out who the true beneficial owner is. Maybe they only have partial ownership of that company. Piercing the corporate veil is difficult. It's difficult for investigators to do. So let's talk about some definitions first. So a shell company is simply a company that exists on paper, and by its very nature, it sounds, a little dubious. People talk about offshore shell companies and they think, oh, that it sounds very, very nefarious. Offshore, by the way, just means outside of a major financial center like New York City or London or Frankfurt. And so a shell company incorporated in the state of Nevada would be considered an offshore shell company, even though it's not a little island in the Caribbean. It's not technically offshore. But it turns out, I would say 95% of shell companies are completely legitimate. They are set up for legitimate legal reasons. There may be some legal tax minimization strategies that they're being used for, but for the most part, like I say, 95% are completely legitimate. I myself have set up a shell company for the purposes of a 1031 exchange, which is, it's a real estate transaction. But front companies, on the other hand, by their very definition, are fronting for some kind of illegal or unethical behavior. Okay, that they're trying to disguise it. Okay, that's why we call it a front company. And a front company can be a shell company that exists only on paper. Okay, and many are shell companies. But a front company can also be a brick and mortar or a company with a brick and mortar presence. Maybe you have a grocery store or a mattress company, a mattress retailer that is really fronting for a money laundering operation. Okay, that would also be a front company. All right. So again, I don't want to give shell companies a bad name. But then there are also shelf companies, which are aged shell companies. And I don't know that there are many legitimate uses for a shelf company, but you could argue that it might help facilitate getting a business loan, for example. There are people who argue that they have legitimate reasons for wanting more privacy. Or I guess they could set up a shell company for that reason too. But it is a shell company that was created 1 month ago, 6 months ago, 6 years ago, and you are buying it. It already has a name associated with it. And it adds another veneer of legitimacy. The fact that something was created months ago or years ago. If you look at the names of some of the shelf companies that are currently for sale on this Wyoming website, they all have really anodyne general names, like this one at the bottom, Associated Business Funding, Inc., or Unique Marketing Concepts. I mean, they're just, you can't even really tell what the business is. And, that's deliberate, of course. And I would say that, you could set up shell companies in every state of the United States. Shelf companies, Wyoming is famous or infamous for their shelf companies. You could probably purchase shelf companies in a lot of different states. But Wyoming, Nevada, and Delaware, and South Dakota in the case of trusts, are well known for not asking for too much information with respect to, beneficial ownership information, like who is the sanctioned Russian oligarch who really is the true owner of this shell company or shelf company that you want to set up. And, that is something that the federal government is going to be cracking down on. Not yet, but they will be, or at least they're supposed to be doing that in the future. However, I will say that just setting up the shell company or the shelf company anonymously, so you don't necessarily really know who is the owner behind it, that's the easy part. It's a lot harder to set up a business account, a bank account for that shell company in the United States, because financial institutions, and for that matter, cryptocurrency exchanges, regulated cryptocurrency exchanges, they are all required to ask a lot of questions and ask for incorporation documentation and ask for beneficial ownership information and ask for expected activity in this account. And, you're going to get a lot of questions. And so that's but it's difficult for investigators when they are trying to find out more information about shell companies that are incorporated in the US very easily, but maybe the account for that company could be set up somewhere else where they don't ask as many questions. Now, when it comes to sanctions enforcement, the first step is listing. We call it listing. And that means having your name or your company name put on Treasury sanctions list. We call it the OFAC sanctions list or SDN list. And that is not done lightly. The people who make those decisions are combing through reams and reams of documentation, including a lot of top secret classified information, before they make the decision to put someone or a company on that list. But once you're on the list, life becomes very, very difficult. It's very, very, very difficult to conduct any kind of transaction, even internationally, because again, of the power of the US dollar, everyone tries to enforce US sanctions. Even if they don't like it, they will do it. So detecting these sanctioned individuals and their activity, who really owns that yacht, that mega yacht, or how do we make sure that we're not inadvertently moving money for that sanctioned individual? That's really difficult. You can try, there are companies actually that whose sole service that they provide is, creating diagrams like this, where they will make all of these connections on your behalf for customers and even single transactions, so that you don't have to do it yourself. That is, a lot of this is outsourced now to try to find, okay, do we know that, how do we know that this money isn't going to Putin's mistress, or some people say that she's actually his wife. And the same thing is happens with cryptocurrency transactions. A lot of people are talking about cryptocurrency being used as a way to evade sanctions. Well, it's actually in some respects easier to trace cryptocurrency transactions than it is to fiat transactions because of the blockchain. And so we can see, how the money moves from one wallet to another exchange, et cetera, all over the world. Whereas if it's a wire transfer going from a bank in the United States to a bank in France, to a bank in Romania, to a bank in Belarus, it's really time consuming to figure that out. And you're not guaranteed to get cooperation on the part of, say, the bank in Belarus to share any information about the transaction. Whereas with the blockchain, it's all there, publicly accessible to anyone. So a lot of these institutions, they're afraid, like I say, of the tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and now billions of dollars in fines that they are having to pay. So they try to be really careful, but mistakes happen. So here's an example of a mistake. This was a drug trafficking network that was sanctioned, way back when, back in 2015. And they, like I say, have been on the sanctions list all this time, but they were still engaged in various activities, maybe not on the US side necessarily, but they were still able to operate in Slovenia. And this software company that they were using was also continuing to operate. And they were receiving payments from Apple's App Store for something that they were providing. And Apple didn't catch it. They missed it because their sanction screening software was looking for DOO without the little periods. If they had put D period, O period, O period, the sanction screening software would have caught it, but it didn't. And they ended up paying $500,000 as a settlement for this really minor violation. But in fact, Apple got off easy. There have been other similar cases where companies have had to pay proportionally much more. And you can thank Apple's legal department for that, probably. There have been other cases. PayPal faced a hefty fine for conducting transactions that amounted to only $7,000 of transactions that were carried out by a sanctioned individual from Turkey. And they explained that their sanction screening software just wasn't working properly and why those transactions were missed. They self-reported it. They admitted it immediately. And which you want to do, actually. If you don't admit it, somebody's still going to find out eventually, and you will have to pay an even higher fine. You get some leniency when you cooperate fully, but it's really easy to make mistakes, and they do not want to make mistakes because it's going to show up in court. What you don't want to do is even put it in an email here. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate obfuscation. Standard Charter was deliberately omitting information from the SWIFT messaging that accompanying its wire transfers because they thought, sanctions are stupid. We're going to do business with whoever we want to. And they ended up paying over $1 billion in fines. But the biggest fine so far on record was BNP Paribas, a French bank that ended up paying nearly $1 billion in fines for violating US sanctions. Now, this sounds like such an astronomical number here. It isn't. There have been multi-billion-dollar fine. I think Goldman Sachs recently paid $6 billion in fines related to the 1MDB scandal, big corruption scandal in Malaysia. So not so unusual anymore, but it was unusual at the time. And why did they agree to pay it, you might ask? Well, it turns out that the sanctions evasion was so egregious that the US authorities said, we have to rescind BNP Paribas's dollar clearing privileges. Well, that's going to put the bank out of business. You can't operate if you lose your dollar clearing privileges as an international bank. And just to give you a sense of how international BNP Paribas is, they have a presence on nearly every continent. They are not only the largest French bank, but I believe they may even be the largest European bank. So when this was originally proposed of rescinding their dollar clearing privileges, Obama who was president at the time, had to get on, well, he didn't get on the phone. Actually, what happened was President Hollande of France called up Obama, very angry, and said, you can't let this happen. We consider this an act of war, destroying our leading bank. And so the $9 billion fine was actually a compromise. Okay, we're not going to take away your dollar clearing privileges, but you need to pay $9 billion in fines and really fix up your sanctions evasion department. They now have the largest sanctions compliance department of any bank in the world. So let's return now to Russian sanctions violations. It's really hard to do, and this is why a lot of institutions are outsourcing this role. Because in addition to just the difficulty of piercing the corporate veil, how do you know that it's the right person? how do you know when you use sanction screening software, as many as 95% of the hits are going to be false positives, meaning it looks like it could be somebody who's sanctioned, but oh, it's not really that person. Different birth date and other things just don't match up. And you could imagine what it's like when you have a country like Russia, where there is a lot of there are a lot of names that are used very frequently, like Alexander. Okay, ignore the middle column here where it says number. That's just from the sampling that they did. But if 7% of people in Russia have the first name Alexander, that's, I believe, close to 9 million people, 9 million Russians with the first name Alexander. And maybe some of them are even going by the nickname Sasha. And, probably another 7 or 8 million with the first name Sergey. And then, of course, you get into different spellings as well, which makes it difficult to detect as also. So there's a slight mistake here. The English and the Russian should be flipped there at the top. But look at all the different, so when you transliterate names that are spelled in different alphabets, this happens a lot with Arabic names, you're going to get a whole variety of different spellings. And this is, just with one name here, and, I count at least 6 different spellings here. And why is this important? Because you need to know, okay, if he is sanctioned, well, what other businesses is he connected to? And those businesses might not be sanctioned themselves, but because he is connected, he is a major shareholder, or usually it's 20 to 25% ownership that they're going for of those businesses. Even though those businesses aren't sanctioned, you have to treat them as if they are sanctioned. It's really, really difficult to do sanctions compliance, but the penalty for mistakes is very high. And it also gets complicated because here we have a Russian oligarch with 3 different passports who now resides in France. Okay. It's unfortunately not that difficult to buy passports, even EU passports. So going back to sanctions enforcement, we have listing, deciding, should we put somebody on the sanctions list? Detecting, I talked about the challenges of that. But then let's say you do identify some assets, whether it's a bank account or a cryptocurrency wallet or a mega yacht or a ski chalet in the Swiss Alps, okay? We talk about freezing, seizing, and then confiscation. And there is a distinction between all 3 of these terms. And it gets complicated too when in some languages there isn't a distinction. Either there aren't separate words for freezing and seizing, or there aren't separate words for seizing and confiscation. That becomes a problem as well from a legal standpoint. But the way that I try to explain this is with this analogy. Let's say that you have a lot of parking tickets that you haven't paid. So the next time the parking enforcement sees that, okay, you're violating again, rather than just putting another ticket on your vehicle, they might put a boot on your tire, which prevents you from using the vehicle. You can't drive away. It's really of no use to you because you can't use it. It would be like locking up your mega yacht or not letting it leave the port. It would be like freezing your account. So you can't put any money in, you can't take any money out. And then seizing doesn't mean that the government has taken your asset and it's now theirs. Not at all. Seizing, and that's what we say, we've seized these Russian oligarchs' yachts. Well, it still belongs to the Russian oligarch. Seizing would be equivalent to towing your vehicle to an impound lot. And so now you have to pay a big fine to get it out of the impound lot, maybe, or maybe you have to, if it's seized as part of a drug raid, you're going to have to go through a lot of legal procedures in order to prove that the vehicle wasn't used for that particular crime in order to get your vehicle back. It's complicated, you know, it's still technically yours, but in order to get it back, it's a pain in the neck. Confiscation is forfeiture. Forfeiture is when the asset is now in the possession and it belongs to the federal government. So Treasury, if they confiscate your accounts, whether it's a cryptocurrency wallet or a bank account, that's no longer yours. You've lost it. The government has gone through the legal procedures in order to take that money. It now belongs to the government. The government can use it for whatever. They can use it to give to the government of Ukraine, for example. If it's a mega yacht, the mega yacht is auctioned off. And we do that. You know, there are people who are convicted of corruption and other things. In this case, it was a big corruption case. This individual had incredible car collections, luxury car collections in Malibu, in the United States, Malibu, California, in Switzerland, and in France. And it was actually more than the 23 million that you see here. Just from the auction that happened in Switzerland, it was $27 million that they brought in. I think the Swiss government pocketed some of that, and then the other 23 million they plan to return to the people of Equatorial Guinea through development programs and vaccines and testing, COVID vaccines and testing. So that, yeah, the government that seizes it can decide what to do about it. What about those mega yachts? We talk about seizing those mega yachts, but that's we can seize them. That's the first step in the process. Forfeiting them is going to take years. It's going to be tied up in litigation for a long time. Don't hold your breath. But again, we can make life difficult for those sanctioned oligarchs who aren't even able to sell those assets. They can't do anything with those assets. They can't use those assets, and they can't sell off those assets. So I briefly alluded to cryptocurrency earlier, and I want to say something about that because a lot of people are saying that, well, the Russian government and other, sanctioned Russian individuals and entities can just use crypto to evade sanctions. And we do have examples of sanctioned countries doing that. So, for example, in the case of North Korea, they're not necessarily using crypto to engage in transactions to evade the sanctions. Rather, they are collecting crypto as a source of revenue. So we prohibit them from selling things like coal and other things. Like right now, we're making it really difficult for Russia to sell oil and natural gas, but they can still earn money and foreign exchange by doing other things. In this case, attacking cryptocurrency exchanges, engaging in ransomware attacks. And we know of at least $3 billion that has been stolen that we can confidently attribute to North Korean state-sponsored groups. And so I'm sure it's much more than that, because attribution isn't easy. The Russians have also stepped up their ransomware attacks as well. I don't know how many of those Russian criminals are state-sponsored, but nevertheless, we are seeing more attacks originate from Russia. Venezuela, for example, faces the same challenges because they are also facing sanctions. And here's where it becomes really difficult for a country when they're faced with sanctions and they can't use the US dollar or the euro or the pound or the Swiss franc. Okay, that's in the case of Russia. That's what they're faced with. So how do you pay foreign airlines that might be landing in your country? Okay, just to use one example. They don't want to be paid in Russian rubles, and they probably don't want to be paid in Chinese renminbi either, because the Chinese renminbi is not fully convertible. So what the Venezuelans did was they set up something called Jetman Pay. And specifically for foreign airlines landing in at Venezuelan airports, they can pay for their airport fees in Bitcoin, and then Jetman Pay, which is not sanctioned, okay, then arranges for that Bitcoin to be converted from Bitcoin into fiat, could be dollars or euros or whatever Venezuela happens to need, at cryptocurrency exchanges, unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges in jurisdictions where US authorities have no reach and no cooperation. So you can do things like that. However, what you can't do is pay for, billion-dollar transactions for, oil and natural gas contracts in crypto. There's just not enough crypto out there to do. The crypto market just can't handle those size transactions, and then converting it into fiat and using it for whatever it is you need. It's really hard to pay for food and medicine with crypto. That may change in the future, but I'm not going to hold my breath. So I'm going to stop sharing here and invite Dan to offer some additional comments, and then we can open it up to questions.
Thank you, Maury. That was exceptionally useful walk through a very complicated world of finance. And I have a few questions for you, but I'll let Dan give some insight from your perspective, Dan, from the financial investing world.
Sure, sounds good. Thanks, Maureen. Thanks, Maury. That was great. I'm Dan Wilfreeze. I've been a NSF board member for about 2 years. Been going to the breakfast meetings prior to COVID for several years. Before that, I moved to Reno in 2015 from New York. I worked for an investment firm run by Mario Gabelli back on the East Coast. Been there since 1998. Went to Fordham University in the Bronx. That's where Mario went for his undergrad. So he pulled his interns from the various schools on the East Coast. So that's how I ended up at Gabelli. So I won't go back to my little personal spiel there. I'm sure most people have heard it, but from our perspective, we manage money for clients and we open brokerage accounts for them. So from that angle, we're reliant on the structure that's in place for money laundering. And that stems back to, I'll give a little history. Back in 1970, the Bank Secrecy Act was put into place, where there was specific record keeping and reporting obligations, currency transaction reports, suspicious activity reports, and that such. That started the ball rolling, and that was followed up in 1996 by strengthening the suspicious activity report and in the money servicing industry. So at that point, suspicious activity reports, where if an institution thinks something funny is going on, they have to report, and certainly anything over a certain dollar amount, has to be reported through the DSA e-file system. And since then, there's been, 30 multiple in terms of transactions being reported through that. In 2001, obviously, we had the Patriot Act instituted, and that's really where the brokerage firms came into play there, where, we had to identify customers, names, addresses, dates of birth, and run that against OFAC watch list, SDN, which is the specially designated nationals list. So if we're opening an account for somebody already being sanctioned or is on a watch list, that's going to pop up, and then we're not going to do business with them. So that's really helped tremendously from our perspective for not even allowing those funds to enter our world. Doesn't mean that it can't enter the banking world somehow, but from our perspective, it doesn't. And then recently, don't know too much more about it, other than there was a 2021 AMLA Act that was put into place that focuses on shell companies and emerging tech companies like cryptocurrencies. And that's certainly something I think we could probably dedicate a whole NSF broadcast on.
It's on my list.
Good. Yeah, that's hopefully nobody owned Luna, or maybe I hope they did, so they put money back into stocks. But from the perspective of money laundering and online brokerage accounts, most recently, if you look back after the CARES Act, post-COVID, where a lot of money was sent out to businesses and people, sometimes without a lot of double checking going on. There's a little over 100 million that ran through online brokerage accounts like Robinhood, E-Trade, those types of companies. Our business, Gabelli, we manage money for high net worth individuals, so we're not in the retail business. But a lot of these bigger companies who open millions of accounts every year, that was a big issue, and we're catching up to that. But that's one of the ways that money can be laundered, and it's by U.S. citizens, not so much outside the country. But from that perspective, maybe what I'll do is I'm going to pass it back to Maureen, because I think I'm getting comments that maybe my audio is not great. I apologize for that, but I guess Maureen, one of my questions.
Oh, Dan, you just went on to mute.
Yep, sorry, just hit my keyboard. One of the questions that I had, the effectiveness of sanctions. How does that relate to, if Russia for quite a while has been getting off the payment system, Visa, MasterCard, they had their own duplicate system set up for processing transactions and doing things through the ruble, and China, if they start reducing their holdings of U.S. treasuries, are we going to have the yuan or renminbi, or are we going to have the Iron Curtain set up? So.
Thanks for that, Dan. So yes, on that issue, there was talk about that Russia and China would create their own separate version.
Or could you repeat the question just so that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So Dan raised the issue of Russia possibly creating its own separate payment system, maybe with China.
Right.
As a way to just circumvent these sanctions and just avoid the Western financial system altogether. And they have been talking about that for some time, both Russia and China, and creating their own version of SWIFT, which would allow them to process international transactions. And it's so complicated to do that, and it is still many, many months, if not years away from happening. But something else is happening now. in conjunction with that, and that is the emergence of central bank digital currencies. And the Chinese are way ahead of us on that. I think the US is really slow behind the curve because of maybe lobbying pressure from the banking industry that feels threatened by the emergence of central bank digital currencies. The smart banks are actually getting licenses to deal in crypto as well. Or I mean, not crypto, let's say just digital currencies, okay? So it would be like a digital dollar. And it's a way of, facilitating payments and making payments as frictionless as possible. So, maybe there's something to it. I think 9 countries are already using digital currencies of their, not crypto, like Bitcoin, that kind of thing. The El Salvador experiment with Bitcoin has been a disaster, by the way, but just digital forms of their own currency. And, China is still beta testing. And then there are half a dozen countries. I think Australia is one of those countries, maybe some other countries in Asia that are they're beta testing a SWIFT system of doing international transactions with those central bank digital currencies. And that will be really interesting. But again, it's months, if not years away. So the US can continue to exercise a lot of leverage with sanctions, because of the primacy of the US dollar. And there are very few other alternative ways to avoid that. But I want to mention something else that Dan brought up. He talked a lot about all of these new regulations, first the BSA in 1970, then USA Patriot Act in 2001, and then most recently the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, which was passed January 1st, 2021, not all of which has been implemented yet. And all of these measures impose a lot of costs on financial institutions of all kinds, whether they be crypto exchanges or brokerages or what have you, in trying to enforce it all. There's a huge punishment if you don't enforce it or make a mistake. And, he mentioned that, they cross-check against the SDN list, which is the OFAC sanctions list, and don't do business with anyone on that list. Well, anybody who is put on that list, whether it be a high-level narco-trafficking kingpin or a corrupt dictator or a sanctioned Russian oligarch, they're going to be smart enough to lawyer up and make sure that their name doesn't appear on anything. They're going to find people to be nominee directors. So we heard, you probably heard about the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, and then most recently the Pandora Papers. These are data leaks where we find out more information about who is really behind these different shell companies. And we found that Vladimir Putin's close friend from childhood, who is a concert cellist, it is in possession of $5 billion in assets. And that's just what we know about, okay? How did he get so much money as a cellist? Well, it's believed that a lot of those assets belong to Vladimir Putin, and he is just the nominee director of those accounts. They're putting things in the names of their children and their spouses, and they could even put it into the name of their chauffeur. The chauffeur would just have to give back power of attorney to the actual owner. So the sanctions really create a headache, not just for the financial services industry that has to enforce it, but for the unfortunate people who share the same name with those sanctioned individuals. Their life becomes more miserable. Their transactions get held up for days or weeks at a time while they try to prove that, oh no, I am not that person. I just happen to have the same name.
Yes, quite a challenge, and we went through that with the no-fly list. So we know that accidentally getting on one of these lists when you're innocent, oh man, it's hard to get off. So a practical question, which I thought was really interesting, which is, okay, so the United States seizes one of these mega yachts, or Europe or some country, and there's this long drawn out legal process for years while you try and decide whether you're going to take it into forfeiture and confiscate it and sell it off and give it money back to the Ukrainians. Who takes care of that? Who pays for the upkeep? Who pays for the people who work on that vessel, who need to be there to keep it running for years?
Right. Yeah. And that can add up. It's quite expensive. Just the upkeep. Well, again, you're not going to like this answer, but the answer is it depends. So when your assets are seized, you obviously can't touch them. I mean, you can't access them, right? But there are exceptions made where money can be used from those seized assets. Let's say you have a bank account that's seized. You can use it for your legal defense. So they do allow money to be used for legal fees and for, I think, medical treatment, and there are exceptions that are made. With a yacht, hopefully you also have some other seized assets. So you have fungible cash that could be used to pay for the upkeep. You don't want it to go into disrepair because eventually you're hoping to be able to auction it off.
Right. So you don't, and then the follow-on question is, and then who buys it? Because how many people, legitimate entities, are out there to buy a multi-billion-dollar yacht?
Actually, there are people who have the means to buy a multi-billion-dollar yacht. I can think of members of Middle Eastern royal families, or successful businessmen and entrepreneurs who definitely have the means to buy it, but maybe they don't want to buy it. Right. This happens when they try to auction off Yakuza assets in Japan. Yakuza is organized crime in Japan. People are too afraid to buy a seized Yakuza asset at auction because they don't want to be retaliated against. Okay. And yeah, I would certainly be afraid of buying something that was seized from a Russian oligarch. Or from Putin. I mean, Putin poisons his enemies, right? And consequently, when they auction it off, the price that's usually paid is well below market value.
Interesting. So watch this space as we see what happens to mega yachts and palaces in the south of France and a few other things like that.
Actually, I will say something else too, and that is that you could hide your ownership behind, nested corporate ownership structures as well. So they don't know who actually bought it, but that might not stop them from sabotaging it. I will say in the case of artwork that is seized from criminals, like Picasso's and Monet's and Basquiat paintings, those generally do sell for market value. But if you ever watch these Sotheby's auctions, nobody ever announces their, they don't
identity.
say who they are when they buy that type of artwork.
So, and Dan brought this point up, and Moyara, I will come back to you on this. I have had numerous requests from people around the community asking us to do a program on sort of cryptocurrency 101, which I am looking to. So I will come back to you for some good recommendations on how to organize that. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask you how the crypto crash that's happened in the last few weeks has impacted entities that were looking to use anything crypto related to avoid the sanctions issues.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that the crash did take the wind out of the sails of a lot of crypto enthusiasts, as I like to call them. Yeah, I mean, I don't invest in crypto myself because I'm a very risk averse investor. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what else there is to say other than it's not going to stop the North Koreans from stealing crypto because, you know, they are running out of options.
Yes, especially now. And the El Salvador case was one where they had invested heavily in that and are now paying a price for that.
Right, right. I will say that, you know, shame on our Congress for not doing more to regulate crypto and especially now Web 3.0 and decentralized finance. I mean, the train has left the station and they're playing catch up. And whether it's, you know, partisan gridlock or just a lack of understanding, they don't even know how to regulate it because they don't understand it. It's unfortunately that leaves investors vulnerable. Okay, because people don't understand it and they're being sold products that unfortunately there's so much fraud. There's so many scams out there. If the next time somebody tries to sell you on a new crypto asset that they say is the latest greatest thing and will yield you you know, returns higher than 7%, you know, run as fast as you can in the other direction. Too many people have been scammed of their life savings that way.
Yes, and Dan, I'm sure you would second that remark.
Yeah, hopefully my mic is a little better. I'm not sure. I hit a system
A little bit.
setting. I'm sorry. This is disappointing, but no, for sure. I think that's an issue. Is if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And I agree with Maury. I think rules and regulations should have been put in place. I don't like the nomenclature cryptocurrency because a currency should be stable. It should be a store of value. And certainly if our dollar was going up or down by 60 or 70% on a monthly basis, we'd be a lot more worried. So in my opinion, it is a security. There is a risk. Maybe there's a place for it, but you need, you know, the systems in place to at least have a framework of regulation. Whether or not you make money or not, hey, that's your own problem. But, you know, as long as you know what you're getting into, I don't think people knew what they were getting into. And there's a whole other topic we probably can have too on, you know, what the Federal Reserve has done and the central banks around the world have done to help, you know, increase the amount of money that's been flowing illegally throughout the world by just having more digital dollars out there or digital whatever. And that's where we are today. So that's a good topic for another conversation.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And I agree with Dan that we should really stop calling them cryptocurrencies, call them crypto assets.
Excellent. I will do that. Thank you. So with that, Maury, I'm just going to let you close us out and give people some pointers on where to follow this. What do you read? What are you tracking? What do you recommend to really understand the world of illicit finance, and in particular how it relates to issues like sanctions in the war in Ukraine?
Right. Okay. Well, if anyone really wants to nerd out on this, I'm going to type in the chat something called KYC 360, which is a blog from Risk Screen, the company Risk Screen. If you go to their website or you just Google KYC 360 Risk Screen, you can sign up for their blog or newsletter. It comes out every week with all the top stories from around the world on illicit finance, including sanctions issues and everything. It's a great news aggregator, and it's free. Okay.
Free is good.
Yeah, free is good. But just what I tell my students, in order to better prepare themselves for the threat intelligence career that they, hope to have, you want to be curious, but you also want to have general knowledge about the world. I tell them to read The Economist magazine cover to cover every week. That's the best preparation.
Thank you. And maybe even listen to their weekly webinars, which I do.
Oh, okay.
They have a regular webinar series right on the war in Ukraine right now, which is fabulous.
Oh, great.
Yes, our little plug for some excellent reading in your spare time. Mm-hmm. So with that, thank you very much, Maury, Dan. Dan, apologies that your sound wasn't clear, but we were very glad you could join us today. Maury, it is absolutely wonderful to have this kind of expertise joining us from NSF, but also local. So we hope to have you engaged in other topics in the future.
I look forward to it. I look forward to attending your NSF webinars and live events as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. So with that, please, everybody, have a wonderful, safe day. And I will be sending out some feedback from our wonderful Youth Security Forum next week and the announcement on our upcoming program in June. So please take care. We look forward to seeing you again very soon.